The other camp counselors came running from the office, the tents, or out onto the lake. They had their guns drawn, but holstered them when they saw that the trouble was over. The warden walked over from her cabin. "There was a riot," Mr. Pendanski told her. "Zero almost strangled Ricky." The warden looked at Zigzag, who was still stretching and massaging his neck. Then she turned her attention to Stanley, who was obviously in the worst condition. "What happened to you?" "Nothing. It wasn't a riot." "Ziggy was beating up the caveman," said Armpit. "Then Zero started choking Zigzag, and I had to pull Zero off of Zigzag, but it was all over before Mom fired his gun." "They got a little hot, that's all," said X-Ray. "You know how it is in the sun all day. People get hot, right? But everything's cool now." "I see," the warden said, and she turned to Zigzag. "What's the matter? You didn't get a puppy for your birthday?" "Zig's just a little hot," said X-Ray. "Out in the sun all day. You know how it is. The blood starts to boil." "Is that what happened, Zigzag?" asked the warden. "Yeah," said Zigzag. "Like X-Ray said. Working is so hard in the hot sun. While Caveman just sits around doing nothing, my blood boiled." "Excuse me?" said the warden. "Caveman digs his holes, just like everyone else." Zigzag shrugged. "Sometimes." "Excuse me?" "Zero's been digging part of Caveman's hole every day," said Squid. The warden looked from Squid to Stanley to Zero. "I'm teaching Zero how to read and write," said Stanley. "It's sort of like a trade. The hole still gets dug, so what does it matter who digs it?" "Excuse me?" said the warden. "Isn't it more important for him to learn how to read?" Stanley asked. "Doesn't that build character more than digging holes?" "That's his character," said the warden. "What about your character?" Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden turned to Zero. "Well, Zero, what have you learned so far?" Zero said nothing. "Have you just been digging Caveman's hole for nothing?" the warden asked him. "He likes to dig holes," said Mr. Pendanski. "Tell me what you learned yesterday," said the warden. "Surely you can remember that." Zero said nothing. Mr. Pendanski laughed. He picked up his shovel and said, "You might as well try to teach this shovel to read. It's got more brains than Zero." "The at sound," said Zero. "The at sound?" repeated the warden. "Well then, tell me, what does C-A-T spell?" Zero glanced around uneasily, and Stanley knew he knew the answer. Zero just didn't like answering questions. "Cat," Zero said. Mr. Pendanski clapped his hands. "Bravo! Bravo! The boy's a genius." "What about F-A-T?" asked the warden. Zero thought for a moment. Stanley hadn't taught him the F sound yet. Zero whispered, "At. Fat." "How about H-A-T?" asked the warden. Stanley hadn't taught him the H sound either. Zero concentrated hard and then said, "Chat." All the counselors laughed. "He's a genius, all right," said Mr. Pendanski. Stanley didn't know why Mr. Pendanski seemed to have it in for Zero. If Mr. Pendanski only thought about it, he'd realize that it was very logical for Zero to think that the letter H made the ch sound. "Okay, from now on, I don't want anyone digging anyone else's hole," said the warden. "And no more reading lessons." "I'm not digging another hole," said Zero. "Good," said the warden. She turned to Stanley. "You know why you're digging these holes? Because it's good for you. It teaches you a lesson. If Zero digs your hole for you, then you're not learning your lesson, are you?" "I guess not," Stanley mumbled, although he knew they weren't digging just to learn a lesson. She was looking for something. Something that belonged to Kiss and Kate Barlow. "Why can't I dig my own hole but still teach Zero to read?" he asked. "What's wrong with that?" "I'll tell you what's wrong with that," the warden said. "It leads to trouble. Zero almost killed Zigzag." It causes him stress, said Mr. Pendanski. I know you mean well, Stanley, but face it. Zero's too stupid to learn to read. That's what makes his blood boil, not the hot sun. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Mr. Pendanski handed him the shovel. Here, take it, Zero. It's all you'll ever be good for. Zero took the shovel and swung it like a baseball bat. The metal blade smashed across Mr. Pendanski's face. His knees crumpled beneath him, and he was unconscious before he even hit the ground. Zero held the shovel out in front of him as if he were going to try to bat away anyone that came near him. I hate digging holes, he said, and then he slowly backed away. Don't shoot him, said the warden. He can't go anywhere, and the last thing we need is an investigation. Zero kept on backing up, out past the cluster of holes the boys had been digging, and then farther and farther out into the lake. He's gonna have to come back for water, the warden said. Stanley noticed Zero's canteen lying on the ground near his hole. A couple of the counselors helped Mr. Pendanski to his feet and into the truck. Stanley looked out toward Zero, but he had disappeared into the haze. The warden ordered the counselors to take turns guarding the shower room and the rec room all day and all night. They were not to let Zero drink any water. When he returned, he was to be brought directly to her. She examined her fingernails and said, It's almost time for me to paint my nails again. Before she left, she told the 6 remaining members of Group D that she still expected there to be 7 holes. All right, let's see. We'll read one more chapter. It's pretty short. Chapter 31. Stanley angrily dug his shovel into the dirt. He was angry at everyone. Mr. Pendanski, the warden, Zigzag, X-Ray, and his no-good, dirty-run, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. But mostly, he was angry at himself. He should have known never to have let Zero dig part of his hole for him. He still could have taught him to read. If Zero could dig all day and still have the strength to learn, then he should have been able to dig all day and still have the strength to teach. What should he do, he thought. What he should do, he thought, was go out after Zero. But he didn't. None of the others helped him dig Zero's hole, and he didn't expect them to. Zero had been helping him dig his hole. Now he had to dig Zero's. He remained out on the lake digging during the hottest part of the day, long after everyone else had already gone in. He kept an eye out for Zero, but Zero never came back. It would have been easy to go after Zero. There was nobody to stop him. He kept thinking that that's what he should do. Maybe they could climb to the top of Big Thumb. If it wasn't too far away, and if it was really the same place where his great-grandfather found refuge, and if, after 100 years or so, water was still there. It didn't seem likely, not when the entire lake had gone dry. And even if they did find refuge on Big Thumb, he thought, they'd still have to come back here eventually. Then they'd both have to face the warden and her rattlesnake fingernails. Instead, he came up with a better idea. Although he didn't have it quite all figured out yet. He thought that maybe he could make a deal with the warden. He'd tell her where he really found the gold tube if she wouldn't scratch Zero. He wasn't sure how he'd make this deal without getting himself in deeper trouble. She might just say, tell me where you found it or I'll scratch you too. Plus, it would mean X-Ray would get in trouble too, and she'd probably scratch him up as well. X-Ray would be out to get him for the next 16 months. He dug his shovel into the dirt. By the next morning, Zero still hadn't returned. Stanley saw one of the counselors sitting guard by the water spigot outside the shower wall. Mr. Pendanski had 2 black eyes and a bandage over his nose. I always knew he was stupid, Stanley heard him say. Stanley was required to dig only 1 hole that next day. As he dug, he kept a constant watch out for Zero, but he never saw him. Once again, he considered going out onto the lake to look for him, but he began to realize that it was already too late. His only hope was that Zero had found God's thumb on his own. It wasn't impossible. His great-grandfather had found it. And for some reason, his great-grandfather had felt the urge to climb to the top of that mountain. Maybe Zero would feel the same urge. If it was the same mountain, and if water was still there. He tried to convince himself that it wasn't impossible. There had been a storm just a few days ago. Maybe Big Thumb was actually some kind of natural water tower that caught and stored rain. It wasn't impossible. He returned to his tent to find the warden, Mr. Sir, and Mr. Pendanski all waiting for him. "Have you seen Zero?" the warden asked him. "No." "No sign of him at all?" "No." "You have any idea where he went?" "No." "You know, you're not doing him any favors if you're lying," said Mr. Sir. "He can't survive out there for more than a day or two." "I don't know where he is." All three of them stared at Stanley as if they were trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. Mr. Pendanski's face was so swollen that he could barely open his eyes. They were just slits. "You sure he has no family?" the warden asked Mr. Pendanski. "He's a ward of the state," Mr. Pendanski told her. "He was living on the streets when he was arrested." "Is there anyone who's going to ask any questions? Some social worker who took an interest in him?" "He has nobody," said Mr. Pendanski. "He is nobody." The warden thought for a moment. "Okay, I want you to destroy all of his records." Mr. Pendanski nodded. "He was never here," said the warden. Mr. Sir nodded. "Can you get into the state files from our computer?" she asked Mr. Pendanski. "I don't want anyone in the AG's office to know that he was here." "I don't think I can erase him completely from all the state files," said Mr. Pendanski. "There's too many cross-references, but I can make it so it'd be very difficult for anyone to ever find any record of him. Like I said, though, no one will ever look. No one cares about Hector Zeroni." "Good," said the warden. Oh no, what's going to happen to Zero? I'm scared for him. I'll read some more on